Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, Professor of Brazilian History and Culture at Brown University and the National Co-Coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the enormous pleasure of interviewing Representative Kamlager-Dove, a Congresswoman who represents California's diverse 37th Congressional District in Los Angeles County. She's a member of the Democratic Party. She is also a member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee and serves as the vice-ranking House member of the House Natural Resource Committee. She is the co-chair of the Congressional Brazil Caucus and a whip and outreach co-chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus. Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove is also a fierce advocate for the African diaspora, both in California's 37th district and around the world. And on a personal note, for someone who lived in Los Angeles for 20 years, it's really an honor to interview a strong progressive voice in the Congress regarding Brazil, the environment, Africa, and the African diaspora. So welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be on this, have this discussion with you.
Great. So let me ask a question. Could you explain to our listeners a bit about the Congressional Brazil Caucus and why you decided to serve as the co-chair of the caucus?
Well, for a number of reasons. Serving as co-chair of the Brazil Caucus interested me. One, it's an opportunity to establish a bipartisan relationship. So I serve as co-chair along with a Republican. B, it was great to kind of restart this while we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the U.S.-Brazil bilateral relationship. 3, it's very important for Congress to have these kinds of caucuses and to really elevate different countries and the issues that are percolating throughout those countries. While we deal with new administrations every 4 or 8 years, it's actually Congress that is responsible for enduring relationships. It is also Congress's responsibility to appropriate funds, to various countries for our, national security or assistance programs. And so I wanted to be the face or one of the faces helping to bridge and build and continue to strengthen the relationship with Brazil. It's also very true that I have a significant Brazilian community in my district. For those that know Los Angeles, Venice and Washington Boulevard on the west side is where you're going to go to get all the Brazilian food, and Culver City is where you're going to go to practice capoeira. And then my platform for my district is LEAD, L-E-A-D, so land and the environment, economic development, arts, and democracy. And I think Brazil has been a great partner and has enormous possibilities and is also challenged with some of the same challenges that we face here in the United States when it comes to land, climate resiliency, protecting the environment, indigenous peoples, when it comes to economic development, making sure that we have economies that are inclusive of everyone, celebrating the arts, incredibly, vibrant communities throughout the United States and Brazil, and then obviously protecting and shoring up democracy. So I thought it was a perfect fit.
Well, we're really glad that you're representing progressive interests in Brazil. This is a wonderful development, shall I say. So in March of this year, you led a congressional delegation to Brazil to deepen U.S.-Brazil partnership in combating racial discrimination. Can you share some of the key takeaways from this trip and any specific initiatives that were discussed to further the goals of the U.S.-Brazil joint action plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination and promote equality, the famous JPER agreement that originally was signed between President Obama and President Lula, and later is now being reinitiated under the new government of President Lula and President Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And as you mentioned, I sit on foreign affairs, and my portfolio includes Africa and Western Hemisphere. So I was invited to lead a Congressional Black Caucus delegation to Brazil to really talk about and learn about race and equality throughout the country. And we focused our delegation in Salvador and Bahia, and then also at the capital. And so it was very important for us to have discussions about JPER. You know, I didn't know about JPER before I came to Congress. And in fact, when we met with folks, it was evident to me that many in civil society also didn't know a lot about JPER and or didn't see how it was being implemented and activated. And so that was very important. Those were important discussions for us to have. My takeaways were that, you know, we have more in common than not when it comes to the challenges that are being faced in Brazil. So the racial justice movements in Brazil and in the United States, we have a lot that we can learn from one another. And we also there are a lot of ways where we can support one another. And I think that delegation trip was actually one of them. I will say I got an opportunity to meet with a number of Black parliamentarians, and that was really eye-opening and also life-affirming that we're talking about very similar issues. I also learned that the role of the evangelical movement is vibrant throughout Brazil, and that they have been terrorizing Indigenous communities and Black communities and LGBT communities throughout Brazil, just like they have been doing in Black communities here across the United States. I learned that the Quilombo communities, you know, are still fighting for recognition, are still fighting to hold on to their land, are still fighting against settlers that are, you know, torching their lands and taking them over. We have that history with our Indigenous communities. We've had that history with, you know, African Americans that were working land. And, you know, then lastly, just learning about the enormous pressure that Afro-Brazilians and the LGBTQ communities are under throughout Brazil. So great that, you know, we have, you know, Rio and Carnival, and it seems like we're celebrating these kinds of diverse communities. But then when you're on the streets having conversations with folks, you realize that they're dealing with a lot of challenges, making sure that they're able to bring, you know, cases to the judicial system, and that there is recognition that things do get adjudicated, you know, that they're able to get their rights, that there is due process for them. We were there the same week that the murderers of Marielle Franco were arrested, and so had the opportunity to talk with her sister. It was a very emotional moment in learning about the fear that the LGBTQ community still has to face, issues around marginalization. And then for the Afro-Brazilian community, you know, the Afro population is 56%, and, you know, 83% of the victims from, you know, police terror are Black. And so, you know, obviously we're dealing with a lot of those same issues here in the United States. So that was a lot, but, you know, I learned a lot, and it made me enormously proud to be a co-chair of the Brazil Caucus and to be working on Brazil issues through Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. But it also reminded me that, you know, we have a lot of work to do across borders and continents to work with our allies that are suffering from the same kind of oppression that we are suffering from here.
Any developments that you might be able to share with us on JPER and how that agreement is working out?
Well, I do think, you know, we have to commit to funding it, you know, and both countries have to commit to funding it, because it's one thing to have recommendations on the paper. It's one thing to, you know, have town halls and to activate civil society. But, you know, at some point, the rubber meets the road when you're talking about appropriations. And so what are both countries going to do? I mean, I know that the United States has pledged, and so that's great. And my hope is that Brazil will find the resources necessary to match that at least, and say, we're going to make a commitment, because I think the initiative is worthy. I mean, we were also there with folks that were instrumental in creating it. You know, we were there with some of the architects of JPER. And so immense possibility, you know, with this initiative. Very similar to the Workers Initiative, you know, that was signed by Lula and President Biden. And so we have come up with these partnerships that show great possibility, but it's not going to be activated if it's not funded. And then it's also not going to be activated if that vision is not shared across departments, right? Education, military, you know, foreign affairs, health, judiciary, so that folks understand that this is a national commitment to tackling race and discrimination.
Wow. Well, speaking of appropriations, let me ask you a follow-up question about the fact that you recently co-led a letter to the Appropriations Committee advocating for the funding for the Amazon Fund in the upcoming fiscal year, following President Biden's $500 million pledge. So why is it important that the U.S. contribute to the Amazon Fund, and how do you envision it impacting environmental conservation and the indigenous communities in the Amazon?
Great question. So I will say, you know, the issue of climate resiliency and climate change is pretty controversial here in the United States. I mean, I have to work with a party, not my own, but with the oppositional party that doesn't quite believe in climate change. So when I was in the state legislature, I worked on these issues. And in fact, you know, met with a delegation from Brazil to talk about the Amazon Fund, to actually talk about the deforestation and the impact that it was having on indigenous communities. And so I had to recall those sessions when I came here to Congress, and decided to join this letter regarding the Amazon Fund. So it's so great that President Biden has pledged $500 million over 5 years to the Amazon Fund. Of course, it is up to Congress to appropriate those funds. And, you know, if I'm going to be honest, I'm going to say it's not going to happen this year. But signing the letter, talking about the letter, builds political will and activation for next year when we change the majority, when Democrats, when folks who understand climate change and believe the science take office. And we will then have the political will to activate this letter. You know, why is this important? Well, you know, Brazil is geographically enormous. And we can't underestimate that. And I don't think you can overstate it enough. And I think that, you know, 60% of the world's largest carbon sink, which is the Amazon rainforest, is within Brazil's borders. So it is incredibly important that we are talking about this. It's incredibly important that we've gotten this pledge. It will be incredibly important for us to appropriate these funds. And then it is also important that Brazil is there also, you know, to work on these issues too, because there's really a larger political and ecological and environmental conversation that needs to continue as a result of this letter, mostly because of the potential power that Brazil wields in this space, not just for its country, but the impact this will have, you know, on the region, on the Western Hemisphere, and really across the globe.
You know, I think some Brazilians might feel a little frustrated with this situation, but forget the fact that President Lula faces the same challenges in a Congress which is quite hostile in some ways to his policies and his ideas, as President Biden faces a very difficult congressional atmosphere at the moment, which makes the kind of will to do things be really challenging. And I think that it's important for us to keep that in mind, that it's not just the desire of a given country or presidency to make these agreements and try to carry out positive cooperation, but the problems of the oppositions, the people who are against it. And that is connected to the question of global warming, because, as you know, Brazil's southern state of Rio Grande do Sul has been hit by rains and floods in recent weeks. It's probably the worst climatic disaster in that region of the world ever. And This has caused tremendous crisis in the country, and it really stresses the urgency of climate change mitigation policies and initiatives in the country. So how do you think we could encourage that to happen in the context of U.S.-Brazil relations, kind of beyond the Amazon Fund, ways to kind of tackle together in partnership the real challenges of the climate change, which is affecting the environment and the weather and everything?
So, first I just have to say that my heart goes out to all of the Brazilians that have either been killed or displaced because of this natural disaster. I feel like I heard the number was upwards of 600,000 people. I don't know if that's true. I've heard it has been likened to, our Katrina. And as someone who lives in California, while we do deal with floods, most of them are in Northern California. We've suffered a number in Southern California. But for me, it's equivalent to the wildfires that we just seem to keep having and trying to figure out ways to combat. It speaks to the fact that, climate change is real and that climate resiliency should be a priority for our countries and for the region. I don't necessarily think it's a matter of Brazil not having, the funds, but to do the kind of cleanup and humanitarian and disaster management that's required. But I do think it gives an opportunity to uplift the humanitarian aid organizations, right? The boots on the ground that have to come in and do this cleanup and support those that are trying to manage through the aftermath of disasters. Why it is important for us to be funding humanitarian aid, why it is also important for us to be, supporting security assistance, because oftentimes, after a natural disaster, there are a number of other issues that, that pop up. Because there's, a vacuum of stability. And then also, I think it speaks to, international climate financing, how we can be working together, to push some reforms in that space. Because, while I hate to use this phrase, but while, more developed countries don't have to deal with this as much or have the funds to kind of support the cleanup, it also sort of, should make us focus on countries that have a lot more poverty or that are lower income, that are also sort of suffering the results of, higher emissions that are being emitted onto their people from, currently developed countries. So it's my hope is that this is something that we can continue to raise, through the Brazilian caucus, but that will also have to be tempered with other things, mostly because, like I said, there are folks in Congress that are oppositional to issues with climate change. But it's this is also something that's not going to go away. And so we have to kind of lean in and address a number of the complementary issues, to this disaster.
Governor Eduardo Leite made a comment recently, was saying, please stop sending donations. It's going to destroy the small business community, which was insane. Everyone said, what are you talking about? But it reflects kind of lack of real compassion and understanding by that sector of the political world in Brazil that is similar to the Republicans, and they're thinking about the country and what should be done to solve problems in a country. So speaking of that, during a recent hearing of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, titled "Brazil: A Crisis of Democracy, Freedom, and the Rule of Law," you challenged, and I would say quite eloquently, I attended the hearing. You challenged accusations.
What did you think?
I think you were extremely eloquent, and I was very proud to hear that a person with your knowledge and your compassion was representing Brazil in such a favorable way. But you did challenge the accusations made by far-right individuals about the Brazilian judiciary. Could you elaborate on what you witnessed there and your perspectives on the current state of democracy and the rule of law in Brazil? It was a very strange dynamic in that commission, I must say, between the Democrats and the Republicans on the commission?
It was a very strange dynamic indeed. So, obviously I'm a first-term Congresswoman, and so I am still learning. I feel like, every day is a surprise, but it was really a surprise for me to be in a hearing, to be in a hearing as a Congress member, a United States and American hearing, okay, as a US Congresswoman, getting heckled by a Brazilian audience, being taunted by Brazilian witnesses, and then not even getting the support from the chair of the committee, who is American. Granted, a different party, but nonetheless. So I chalk that up to being a woman and being a Black woman, but I also chalk it up to the fact that, far right wing insurrectionists and far right wingers are very unified in how they are working together within their country and across countries to destabilize and delegitimize democracy. And so, what I saw happen in that hearing were folks from the far right wing of Brazil coming in, and being legitimized through this hearing to lock arms with folks from our Congress who support or who are far right wingers in, making more fragile our democracy, in spreading disinformation, in sort of attacking the systems, the democratic systems that both of our countries, depend on and some of us are working to fortify. So that was surprising. And as you mentioned, I did have to do a little clap back. I thought it was also quite odd that the witnesses that the Republicans called up, had lied in testimony. They're under investigation by, your judicial systems in Brazil and are incredibly untrustworthy, and they have no credibility, in my mind. Now, there are also folks that, were behind or supported the January 8th insurrection that Brazil, had to deal with. And like I said, we're drawing from our January 6th insurrection. And so it's very dark indeed when you have these forces come together and essentially give each other a high five and say, hey, wasn't January 6th, wasn't January 8th okay, And so instead of talking about how we can fortify, and uplift democracy, they were actually trying to delegitimize it. Now, dissent and debate are part of democracy. And yes, we should be talking about and we should be critiquing it, but we should not be working to undermine it. I was also surprised that they were giving credence to this rise in misinformation and disinformation, and essentially locking arms with platforms that are supportive of that, probably for their own, to support their business model. I had huge problems with that. Now, I recognize that there was a desire for us to kind of, go hard on Brazil, but that's not our place. Our place is to question and to elevate and to learn, and it is to support democracies, free and fair democracies, and to support countries that want to go through, transitions of power in a way that is peaceful and that is in accordance with their constitution, is in accordance with their branches, right? Executive, judicial, and legislative. And so, I didn't want to, because it's not my place, to lean in and say, hey, this is what you should be doing. But that is what we want to support. And so it was eye-opening indeed. I mean, it was like going to a very bad rock concert, and I was not interested in the music that they were playing.
It's very interesting because, the Paulo Figueiredo, who was the grandson of the fifth of the generals who took power during the dictatorship, he portrayed his grandfather as this democratic figure and, in favor of democracy, when in fact, during the worst years of repression, he was in charge of basically the internal information services of the country, which oversaw the torture and repression of oppositionists, including the death of the journalist Vladimir Herzog, who the image was shown in the hearing. And so it was very bizarre for me also, as a person who's been following the history and the culture of Brazil for 50 years and had written about the dictatorship, to hear this kind of retelling the story.
It was revisionist history. I know. And
was
he
really
was a weak leader, according to the history books. So I didn't want to go into that. I didn't want to defame the man's, legacy, but I thought, don't play me with some fake history.
Yeah. I mean, you have also mentioned the similarities between Brazil and the United States, and I teach history of Brazil, and I always talk about this with my students. And we share lots of wonderful traditions. We share horrible histories of the history of slavery and the extermination of the many people in the indigenous communities of Brazil. But we also have strong desires for democracy in both countries. And in this regard, during the 2022 elections, President Biden and his administration expressed tremendous trust in the Brazilian electoral system, throughout the election campaign, believing in the system and sending a message that any kind of unlawful challenge of the results would not be supported by the U.S. How important was this position in your view? And I think for those who have studied Brazil from afar, and Brazilians themselves, the bad memories of 1964, when unfortunately the United States government erroneously, through the filter of the Cold War, supported the military that came to power and recognized the government. But what happened in 22 was just the opposite, where the United States was saying, we will not support a military regime should the armed forces wish to take power. And in my assessment, that was a very crucial way to put a damper on the desires of sectors of the armed forces in Brazil to actually try to overthrow the elections. And the failed insurrection was a part of that plan. So is this a sign in your mind of that relations between the United States and Brazil or Latin America are different regarding democracy and elections?
So, the United States has a complicated history with a lot of countries, especially countries in Central and South America. And I think there's always tension, because when things go sideways someplace, folks jump up and say, the United States, you have a moral obligation to do something. The question is always, what is that something, right? And oftentimes that something is kind of predicated on our history with that country. Obviously, I'm incredibly sensitive to, colonial or patriarchal, applications, right, that we offer. I think what President Biden said was incredibly important, and he said, we're not going to put our thumb on your scale of democracy. But he also said, if you're going to support a coup, if you're going to condone a coup, I'm not with you, right? This is not a coup, but folks that were involved in that are supportive of that. And so I think that's really important. And I think that is our moral obligation to say, we are going to support the results of a free and fair election, but we are not going to be supportive of this kind of militaristic or authoritarian, intervention, and then have you mask it and say, this is democratic, and then have us, turn kind of a blind eye to that. And I think Biden's pressure application was, provided a turning point and a course correction for Brazil to say, okay, we don't want to lose this partnership with this country who's incredibly important to us. And it will empower the folks that have been working to, fortify Brazil's democracy to push back, on those folks that were really interested in moving Brazil in a different direction. So I think it was a pivotal moment, both for our bilateral relationships, but also I think about, national security issues and applications and implications in the long run. And I think what he did was incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think that, we'll only know in 20 or 30 years when we can have full access to many of the archives, but it seemed clear from reports we've received so far that the military was divided, and one sector said, we're not going to do do anything. We're not going to support the attempted coup that Bolsonaro was promoting because we're not going to get the support of the United States. And they realized that this was strategic, and therefore they decided not to walk down that path. And I'm very glad that that happened, that we actually caused a split in the military as a result of that, or many forces caused that split. And I think the Biden administration's voice on this question was really crucial. So challenges for the future. As a co-chair of the Brazil Caucus, what do you see as the things that you would like to push forward in the future to strengthen the 200-year relationship between the two countries? Rocky roads at times, but at other times, really wonderful collaborations. What do you see as the possibilities of future work between the two countries?
Well, I'm excited. As I mentioned, the fact that it is a bipartisan caucus does sort of provide more guardrails than I would like, but I can do other things outside of the caucus. I think that what I'm hoping we will see is an opportunity to have more discussions about, trade and investment, that we will find other ways to celebrate the 200th anniversary of a bilateral relationship, that we can have discussions on, culture and, people-to-people ties and supporting greater understanding. I'm excited that while we're also celebrating, you all are celebrating, or we're all celebrating the 200th anniversary of our bilateral, relationship, that Brazil is also, I think, hosting the G20 and the COP30. And so I'm hoping that we will be able to infuse some preparatory events and activities and discussions through the Brazil Caucus to prepare for that. And I'm going to just also continue to do other things as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and the work that I do with the Global African Diaspora Initiative through the Black Caucus, to talk about strengthening democracy, to talk about human rights violations, to talk about Afro-Brazilian rights, to talk about, climate resiliency, because it's also not lost on me that, when Bolsonaro was in office, he also worked with a lot of bad actors to accelerate deforestation, much of that impacting indigenous communities. So that certainly will probably not happen through the Brazil Caucus, but we can use the Brazil Caucus to talk about these other things, and obviously trade, investment, security assistance, humanitarian aid, and encouraging Brazil to be a greater force across the region is something that I'm hoping we can help channel through the caucus.
Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. This has been a fabulous interview, and we're really looking forward to following you and the work that you intend to do to forge this relationship between the two countries, to strengthen it from a progressive point of view, which I think is very important, to address the social, economic, environmental, cultural questions that face Brazilians and the ways in which the United States and Brazil can collaborate. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. And I will have to come back when I have returned from Brazil, because I will be going there in July, representing the United States as part of the P20 meeting of women parliamentarians around the globe. So I will be in Marcelo, I think if that's how you pronounce it, representing the United States. But I'm going to continue to be talking about all of these issues, and I will be doing it then as well. And just really excited about the possibilities that are in front of both of us.
Well, we're really happy that you're working on Brazil, and we hope we can you can visit us again on Brazil Unfiltered in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed the interview today. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.